Miranda writes, okay, so when we're tackling narrative, we always start with the problem, right? What's the problem with Miranda? The problem is it's designed to inform people of their rights so they can make a meaningful decision about whether to speak to police when they're being interrogated. And the problem is almost every single one of our clients, Patrick can attest, waives Miranda, ignores their rights, and talks to the police, and they talk their way into a jail cell. And the question is why? And I submit it's because they're written all in and you have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can be, and you have the and like when we speak in and, which is what we lawyers do all the time because it's just an onslaught of information, nobody's paying attention, and bad things happen when people don't pay attention. And so I sort of said, what about in a perfect dream world, we could rewrite the Miranda rights as an ABT that really focuses on the central problem, which is, you have a right to a lawyer. And if you can't afford one, we'll get you one. But if you talk to us, we're going to use everything you say to put you in jail. Therefore, maybe you ought not to talk to us until you consult a lawyer.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ABT Time podcast, where this is going to be episode number 53. And as you know, we had a big hiatus from back in May until just a couple weeks ago, where we got back online. So now we're doing a second episode here that will be lots of fun. And this is our law episode. That will be the theme for today. We have two wonderful guests, first of whom Doug Passon is my co-author in the law version of the Narrative Gym book, and then he'll be introducing and bringing on a colleague of his, Patrick Barone, and we're going to get deep into law in relation to the ABT and how it fits into that. Let's see what's going on in ABT land. It is November now, and we're kind of gearing down at the end of the year. We had a very, very busy year. I think in the last episode, I reviewed all the different groups that we worked with and all the exciting, fun things that are coming up in the new year in ABT land. So no need to review all of that. Let's get right down to business here. And let me begin by bringing on Doug Passon, my colleague of the last 3 years or so. And as you know, we began the course in April of 2020. We did it for about a year and then began to realize we had a whole new take on the ABT and its framework. So I wrote a first book that was just called the Narrative Gym, that began to lay out the model of the ABT framework and how we draw this parallel of physical fitness. Then Park Howell, who's one of the stalwarts of the course, he's one of the 4 guest lecturers we have come back over and over again. He's done probably 25 to 30 times in the course. He looked at that book and said, that's nice, but my business people are not going to buy this book and use it unless we set the whole ABT framework into their world, the business world. So he and I set to work on the business version of the Narrative Gym, and that is sitting right here. Here is the business version. And no sooner did we do that than Doug had begun to join us and give some talks to the group. And he said, there you go. He said, well, let's do the law version of the Narrative Gym book. And so he and I set to work on that. And I began to learn some interesting comparative aspects of law in that by the time we were done that collaboration, I began to see this really broad spectrum from how these different professions work. At one end, we have science. It's very detail oriented. At the other end, we've got the entertainment world, Hollywood and filmmaking, and the art world that's really not that caught up in the details. Kind of in the middle is the business world that's really equal amounts of both ends, very creative and broad, and yet also still kind of interested in the details. And then somewhere between business and science, I think, is law, because what Doug and I began to realize was that lawyers, of course, are very detail-oriented and scientists are very detail-oriented. And so they end up being pretty close to the science world. And as a result, it was challenging working on that draft. That was the hardest one to come up with. We used this ongoing example ABT in each version of the book. We have that one example that we use to illustrate all the basic dynamics of the ABT. And that one in particular, it took us a lot of time to really kind of get it pegged down. But eventually we got there. And let's see, Doug, you want to begin, before we get into the specifics of the book, with just a few words on your background. Doug is both lawyer and filmmaker. And how's about a little intro, Doug?
All my life, all I ever thought about being was a lawyer or a filmmaker. And so I've been doing story longer than I've been doing law. But when I was in college, I had to make a choice. And therefore, I decided if I didn't want to be a starving artist living on my parents' couch till I was 35, that I probably ought to go to law school, that I was going to be in better shape. But I always wanted to be a defense lawyer, especially a public defender. So that's what I did. I soon found out story was everything in the law. And you know what's the
Whoa.
great?
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
I'm going to guide this a little bit.
Okay, good. Because I
Yeah,
can go on.
let's take a moment there on why in the world were you drawn to be a public defender? And given that my older brother is also.
Yeah, I think because I grew up as a kid who was a little different and on the outside and got picked on, and I didn't like bullies, and I had an anti-authority streak running through me, and I was the kid that was always in trouble as a kid, and so I just thought the idea of being able to kind of stand up to bullies and defend people who didn't have a voice on their own would be a really cool, meaningful, exciting way to make a living. And I was right. I could tell you some stories.
Well, this is already interesting because in a bit we're going to bring on Patrick, and we're going to talk about this term psychodrama and the whole field of that. And I think what we've already been thinking about is that Patrick in some ways was pre-adapted to the ABT. His mindset already was such that when the ABT came along, like, oh, that's it. Same thing happened with Park Howell, and I think the same with you probably. There's something about your having been drawn into the drama of the underdog, basically, with public defendering, that might make you a bit more prone to really get the ABT instantly. A lot of what we're getting consumed with nowadays, trying to figure out why is it we've got this group of people that just get it in the first moment, and they never have another moment of doubt about how important and powerful the ABT is. And then so many people, it just blows by them. Well, that's just another thing to do. But you're part of our inner group there that has gotten it from the beginning. And then, with the course, we have about 25 people like that we have these long discussions. And do you feel like that's an element?
I will say that because I have been studying story for so long, I was primed and ready for the ABT when it happened, which is when I heard you on, I think, Park Howell's podcast, which is I've been knee deep in every book and every story model since the beginning of time, like back to Aristotle. And I had been trying to teach lawyers how to be better storytellers, but it was always very, very complicated. And when you came along and said, no, we're just going to boil this down to and, but, and therefore, three forces of narrative, this is how it works. I was like, well, yeah. And that was everything I needed to just sort of crystallize and gel. And now that's all there is for me. And I know, and the beauty is all the stuff I had done before, it's baked in the cake. It's all in there. But the key is what you say, which is how do we make complicated things simple? That's the basis of all effective communication. And the ABT was just a lightning bolt. Obviously, this is what to do. That's why I stalked you and forced you to write the law version of the book.
Yeah, let me add another little tidbit here of why this is also resonant is that Matt and I started the course again April 2020 and jumped in there, and we had one set of beliefs coming out of our story circles training for the previous 5 years, one of which was this idea that of the three elements, the and, but, and therefore, your challenge is to keep that and to the bare minimum, because and is, and that gets boring. You want to get right to the problem with the but, and that's what people are really excited about. And then once you get the but out there, then you want to get to the therefore. Well, as we've gone on in the 40 rounds we've done of this course, and 40 rounds has just been an enormous amount of time we put in. And most of those early rounds, the first 20 rounds of the course that we did, 10 1-hour sessions, almost every session was followed up with a conference call with everybody in our group that was in that session. And some of those would go for an hour and a half, thinking, talking, this sort of stuff, making sense out of it. And what began to emerge from it, as Matt could tell you, was a greater understanding, appreciation for that opening material, the and material, the setup. And how you set things up is everything in the end. Whether you have any impact at all is really dependent upon how you set it up. And you don't set things up right, then it just blows away. And towards that very end, this is one of the realizations I've come to, is that this is what Doug has developed as his entire life's work, which is these sentencing mitigation videos, which are really mostly the blue material, the context, the backstory, to understand this person before you give the sentence out. Let me tell you a story about what happened before this crime happened, and putting things into better context. Is that not pretty much what you'd say in a nutshell? Mostly what your mitigation videos are about is, in a word, context.
Yeah, and I think you would say part of the goal of the blue material is connection, right?
And by blue material, we're talking about the and material.
The and material, yeah, to set the stage and set the stakes, but to say, there's so much otherization that goes on in my practice, and it's beginning with the offense. The courts want to define a person by their worst moments, their crime, and I'm here to say, well, no, we're all human beings here. Let's dig in and tell the story. So,
wait, slow that down. Say that again.
Yeah,
that's great. That's a great distillation of that's your battle that you've got there. They've got one goal of defining it by the worst moment in their life, and you've got another goal. Yeah, that's
yeah.
Great.
And the extra buts, the added conflict on there is not only have they done something that's otherizing, like I could never imagine committing a crime like that, so I have to judge you, but they don't usually look the same as the judge. They don't talk the same as the judge. They don't have the same educational background, same social background. It's whatever the case may be. There's a barrier. There's a huge wall of disconnection built up between my people and the decision makers, and the way that we break through that wall is through narrative. That's the way, because that's how you start to see yourself in the other. And when you start to see yourself in the other, then you start to root for them a little bit more.
Okay, so
connection,
exactly. You were pre-adapted to connect with the ABT structure as soon as you came across it. Then we wrote the book, and tell me about, since we came out with the book, which is probably getting close to 2 years ago, I think. What kind of reception have you gotten? My favorite part, and I think the most powerful part, is the very opening, where you point out that the Miranda rights that are age old are actually and would be more powerful if they were ABT structured. So tell us the two things: how the book is done in general, and then what the response to that specific example has been.
Yeah, so I think the book has been very well received, and when we get Patrick on here, he'll be patient zero, because he's a convert. Basically, when lawyers hear this, they are by and large all in, and it's changed the way I've approached my narrative work with lawyers, so they love it. The book's easy to understand. They like that it's short and easy to digest. They understand that it takes work. The Miranda thing is just a perfect example. When I teach now, so I teach story, and I include the Miranda thing, and I have this whole cute video montage of all the Miranda rights.
Tell us in a nutshell what you mean by the Miranda thing.
The Miranda rights. Okay, so when we're tackling narrative, we always start with the problem, right? What's the problem with Miranda? The problem is it's designed to inform people of their rights so they can make a meaningful decision about whether to speak to police when they're being interrogated. And the problem is almost every single one of our clients, Patrick can attest, waives Miranda, ignores their rights, and talks to the police, and they talk their way into a jail cell. And the question is why? The rights are there. The Supreme Court said these are important constitutional rights. They're so important that the police have to tell you about them, and they go in one ear and out the other. And the question is why? And I submit it's because they're written all in and you have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can be, and you have the and like when we speak in and, which is what we lawyers do all the time, because it's just an onslaught of information, nobody's paying attention. And bad things happen when people don't pay attention. And so I sort of said, what about in a perfect dream world, we could rewrite the Miranda rights as an ABT that really focuses on the central problem, which is, you have a right to a lawyer. And if you can't afford one, we'll get you one. But if you talk to us, we're going to use everything you say to put you in jail. Therefore, maybe you ought not to talk to us until you consult a lawyer. I mean, that's the truth of what Miranda is supposed to communicate, but it doesn't. And that's why we get in all that trouble. That's why our clients get in all that trouble.
What would it take to ever change that?
Miracle, act of
Exactly.
God. I
Exactly.
don't know. Guess who
Yeah.
wrote Miranda?
Who?
Prosecutors and police. That's who. Now, I'm not saying they knew the ABT didn't exist in this form in the 1960s. I'm guessing there was no Dr. Randy Olson to school them, but
Well, but you know what? To that very point, in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. did not know ABT, and yet he wrote this brilliant, powerful, persuasive, motivational speech, "I Have a Dream," with perfect ABT structure to it. The same thing. So the people that wanted to persuade intuitively knew how to do that. And then the people that didn't want to persuade intuitively knew how to write it in a way that wasn't going to
it
persuade.
sure seems like somebody had a lot of expertise in bad narrative form. I don't know. Could be a coincidence.
Okay, so now tell me what's happened since you got it out there in the book. Has anybody found it interesting, or they just kind of chuckled and said, "Oh, that's kind of cute"?
No, I think everybody finds it interesting because listen, in my work, whether it's creating sentencing mitigation videos or I just do story consulting with teams, all the way up to death penalty cases to help them build their narrative. I always go with the ABT. We always start with the problem. We always work on the Dobzhansky, finding our one thing. And without fail, lawyers are drawn to this. They love it. They understand it, and they realize that this is the way. This is the way forward. I mean, I have never had a team or a lawyer push back and say this is a waste of time or this doesn't make sense. The lights go on and they start to get it. And we could talk about Dobzhansky too later on, but that for me has been my great beacon, my lighthouse, my guiding light for all the work.
Well,
And I
and
and I
yeah,
will just say one more thing. When you taught me, because I've been giving these presentations, but when you had me give a talk on the and material for one of your classes, you forced me to structure that all in ABT form. And that has been my model now for all the presentations I do. And I can tell the palpable difference of the energy in the room that people are all in from the very beginning when I started communicating in that way, which I wasn't doing.
yeah. And I think if you had to express that in one word, it would be arcing. And I think that's it. That once you get that structure in there, you've got an arc to what you're doing, and the audience everything changes. You talk differently when you're following an arc. You have a tone in your voice in the first act, okay, welcome everybody. Then in the
Yeah.
middle part, you have a different tone, and then you've got a tone towards the end. And as we know, we're wrapping it up here. And if you don't have that structure, you don't have that tone. If you don't have that tone, the audience is not picking up on that, and they start to hate you. Like, it feels like you're talking the same way right now that you were a half hour ago. Where are we going with this?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all woven together into a package. The more you do it, the
Mm-hmm.
more, and the whole audience picks it up. I think there are levels that people don't really even quite understand how they pick it up. Um, and so has anybody really been deeply connected with the Miranda example and thought, wow, that's really profound, or they just see it as a novelty?
Well, I don't think anyone sees it as a novelty. I think it's just a very good way to kind of prove the point. But usually when I'm talking about Miranda, I'm doing it in a like a lecture format, so there's not a lot of interaction. So it's hard to tell generally how that piece of it is landing. But I just know in general the whole talk lands well.
Yeah,
And I'd
yeah.
love to see if you could track the spikes in the sale of the narrative gym because I always put a thing up at the end. And I just wonder who's going online to buy that book after I'm done talking about it. But
Interesting.
I haven't checked. But
Yeah, yeah.
people are into it, and I mean, like I said, Patrick's the proof.
Well, okay, and it's time to lay the foundation for bringing Patrick on, and it begins with this term psychodrama. So, you want to say a few words about psychodrama and the more analytical side of what you mean by that?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I met Patrick, so an incredible lawyer based in Detroit, and we met working on a case together. And I quickly found out we had so much in common on so many levels. But what really was super interesting to me about Patrick is his love for psychodrama. So what is psychodrama? I had heard of it we teach lawyers how to do that in jury trials, but I never knew what it was really until I met Patrick. And I mean, he'll give you the technical term. I think it's like the embodiment of the ABT. I think it's a reenactment of the entire narrative journey. It's a full body process. He would call it reenactment therapy.
Okay,
But
wait a second. Before we go further on that,
yeah,
Devo and Ayla are going to join us eventually in this discussion. But right now, Devo, if I was to tell you that one of the people you work with has a love for psychodrama, how would you interpret that statement?
I would definitely want a definition of what you mean by psychodrama, because there's another more common sort of use of the term, and it's not correct, and it's certainly very much more dramatic.
Exactly. If I said,
yeah,
"Oh, my friend loves psychodrama," yeah, you would think, "Oh,
Right.
God,
And omitting the as Doug was indicating, a more of a truthful or accurate portrayal, and they definitely omit that. They definitely sidestep that and go into whatever sort of dramatic thing they like.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, all right. So, Doug, back to the analytic.
yeah. It's a weird name, especially when you're a criminal defense attorney, because psycho has a whole other connotation.
Exactly.
But it's a form of therapy, and it's immersive. You know, Patrick and I were just together doing work on a case and working with a client, and the whole goal was to sort of peel back the layers and get to the narrative. But what I realized is it's the ABT in action. You've got this whole like beginning where you're in agreement and you're setting the stage and you're connecting, and then you go through this process. And I couldn't even explain it to you if I tried, but it's like, you know, the hero's journey: death, resurrection, trials, tribulations. Like, you are just in it. And in this word of contradiction, when you're in the butt land, is so resonates so deeply in psychodrama, because you're literally taking on contradictory roles. You do all this role playing where, okay, I'm no longer Doug. Now I'm Randy Olson, thinking about how Doug might be thinking about psychodrama. Like, everywhere you turn, there's looking at something from a contradictory angle, a different perspective. And then, of course, you bring it all home with the resolution, the therefore, and hopefully come out like much clearer, much better vision of where you're going and what your story's about, or whatever the case may be. And so I just thought this is the way we've, like, physically, with every fiber of our being, reenact the ABT. That's how I look at psychodrama.
Yeah, interesting.
It's
okay,
really cool.
Talking about bringing it home, let's bring in Patrick now. Patrick, you want to join us? And let's see. How about if you give us a few words of introduction of where you met Doug and your collaboration with him?
Okay. So I'm a criminal defense attorney, as Doug said, in Detroit, in the greater Detroit area. And for almost 30 years, I focused my practice pretty much exclusively on the defense of intoxicated drivers. And recently had started broadening the practice of the firm to include white collar and other types of federal cases. And we had a particular client who was interested in sentence mitigation, and I brought Doug in on that case. Didn't know who he was. I had been referred to him by someone else in my community and heard good things. And immediately when Doug and I met, as he's already indicated, we just connected on all these different levels. And one of them was the ABT. And since that time, we have been working together on...
Wait. Slow us down on that part. What do you mean you just suddenly connected on the ABT? What do you mean by that?
Well, as Doug indicated, psychodrama, and I'll explain it a little bit more deeply if I may. Psychodrama it's a deep form of immersive reenactment therapy, and it was developed by a psychiatrist who was a colleague of Sigmund Freud back in Vienna. And it's really, his name was J.L. Moreno. He's a psychiatrist. He's the founder of group therapy. And he developed this thing called psychodrama, which is reenactment therapy. And so what you would do in psychodrama, instead of talking to your therapist about whatever the issue is, maybe some unresolved business you have with a family member, maybe a parent, maybe a mother or a father, you would, in a group, reenact whatever the event was that's causing you some type of emotional distress. So you would pick someone in the group to play the part of your father, and then the person who's trained in psychodrama, they're called the director, and then they assist you in working through that issue with your significant other, with your parent, in this case, your father, perhaps. And in a classic psychodrama, and I think this is what Doug was alluding to, there's this thing called the Hollander curve. So you go to the issue that is in present day, and then you try to determine when that issue first arose in the person's life. So you're going earlier in time. So you're sort of going into the underworld in a way, and you're trying to figure out what the nidus is of this particular problem that you're having, and then you explore it effectively in the underworld, and then you bring it back to present day. So you're doing the full cycle. You're bringing it back to present day, and then you're using the knowledge that you gained by the reenactment, by the role reversal, and by the synthesis of that. You're bringing it to the normal world, to your present day, and you're reenacting the same issue.
And so the term psychodrama, then what it's basically saying is the reenactment part, that's the drama part of the term. And then
Correct.
you're using the drama to get to the deeper parts of the psychology of everything that's going on. So
Which
that's
is where
kind
the psycho comes from, right? Exactly.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, that's breaking it down. Very interesting. And so then what was your ABT moment that you, like in the training, we've got this term, we call it the Liz moment. One of our early members of the group, Liz Foote, had used the ABT for a talk way back 10 years ago, and turned out to be the best talk she ever gave, and then wrote me a long email and said, oh my God, 3 things. I found this talk easier to rehearse. When I gave it, I saw people more engaged than ever before. And then afterwards on social media, people regurgitated what I said more clearly than ever before. And we define that as the Liz moment. And more, we find that an awful lot of the people that really have got a deep connection to appreciating how powerful the ABT is they've had their one Liz moment, where up until then, they thought this thing's kind of interesting. And then they actually used it and were never the same after that. Like, wow, that's what they're talking about. Did you have anything along those lines?
Absolutely. I was originally attracted to it because I had studied the hero's journey and that model, and I'd also studied another way of storytelling through what's called the Jerry Spence Trial Lawyer College. And then in psychodrama, there's this thing called the sociometric cycle, which is another way of looking at the same thing. And when I heard about the ABT, I just thought to myself, this just simplifies everything. It's as I said to Doug, it's a structured reiteration of the hero's journey. And it's very easy to understand, not so easy to get right and to apply effectively. But it creates a very simple method to distill the most important parts of storytelling down to their essence. And then you can work with them and tell them in a particular way.
And let me add something to that. And Doug, this is maybe a way you should package it more and more that's just dawned on me in recent months, is that so there's 2 fundamental tools. We got the ABT and we got the Dobzhansky. And the ABT is and, but, therefore, and then the Dobzhansky is the simple template that helps you get this one core word, kind of the theme. And then nowadays, as I run through those whole tools and like, oh, look at how exciting new this whole stuff is, the thing I tack on at the end is, by the way, none of this is new. They're 2 age-old elements for creative writing, which is plot and theme. And that's it. And all this is a new way to get your plot, ABT, and your theme, the Dobzhansky, that are more analytical and geared to a world of too much information of today. And that's the problem we've got today, is everybody's so inundated with information. They don't have the time to really digest hundreds of novels and everything else like that and develop this deep intuition. They need these tools immediately. And that's what this is. The age-old 2 standard tools, plot and theme, just made into a much more practical, applicable version. And that's why it's been a one-way journey. Everybody that uses this stuff keeps using it. And nobody's said, we tried it and it didn't work for us. But that's really good. Now, I was wondering if you could tell us this one little anecdote that you had sent me an email about recent experience in presenting this at an event or something.
Yes, I would be happy to do that, but I am mindful of the fact that I didn't actually answer your question, which is whether or not I had a Liz moment.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Keep going on that first. Then we'll get into this other thing.
Okay, good. So yes, the answer is yes. So first of all, as Doug indicated, it's all about connection, especially as a trial lawyer. When I'm presenting a case in court, if I'm not making a connection with the fact finder, which most cases would be the jury, I'm not going to win the case. And it's a storytelling battle. I can't just tell the anti-story that the prosecutor's telling. I need to tell a completely different story that is actually closer to the truth of what really happened, which includes why my client was motivated to do whatever he may or she may have done to bring them into contact with the police, etc. So as soon as I heard about the ABT, I'm like, this is a great way for me to start structuring my storytelling. And then I started using it. And the first time that I used it in court was the first thing I can think of was when I was using it for a violation of probation in front of a judge that I thought certainly was going to incarcerate my client without any question, because they were ordered not to use alcohol and they did. And I had to basically persuade the judge that incarceration was not the appropriate thing. And I used the ABT in order to structure my argument with the assistance of Doug. At first, I was always asking Doug to sort of help me brainstorm this whole thing. And then I presented it to the judge and walked out with my client, which Doug knows what that means. Criminal defense attorneys will know what that means, but you may not know what that means, or you can figure it out. That means that they didn't go through the other door, which is on their way to jail. If they walk out with me, that means they're not going to jail. So
I know that from watching too many episodes of Dateline during the pandemic.
Right. So keep going. They walked out with me. I know it was a victory. And that was really mind-blowing to me. And I structure virtually everything that I do now, as far as all my legal communications, all of my pleadings, all of my communication with the court, et cetera. And also trial preparation. It's all based on the ABT model. So in conjunction with that, I do quite a bit of teaching like Doug, and we have joined forces in that regard as well. And so I'm starting to teach lawyers here in the Detroit area, the ABT, and I've done it a few times. And the time that I did it most recently, there was in the audience one of the other faculty members who had spoken before I had, and she spoke on the topic of storytelling. And she used what is referred to as the trial lawyer college method of storytelling. And I know what that is. I've been trained in it, and I find the ABT to be more compelling as a way to structure story. And so I was sort of already was aware she may not be all that interested in trying to learn something new. But what surprised me was, as I was surveying the audience to see if I was making a connection with them, I see her working on her computer with her back toward me. And I said, that just says 1,000 words, doesn't it? She was communicating everything that she needed to communicate about what she thought about my subject matter just by her gesturing. And unfortunately for her, she could have learned something really cool and really new that could really help her, but she chose not to. She rejected it.
You want to know something that makes me think? I was years ago after a talk, a woman came up to me, and her husband was really wealthy, and they were visiting Australia, and they were in Perth, Australia, and they got invited to this big banquet, and she ended up sitting next to the CEO of a big mining corporation there in Australia. And she thought, oh my God, this is my big opportunity as a climate activist. And she began lecturing the guy about, do you realize that you're destroying the earth with all your coal mining, blah, blah, blah. And she said the guy, after about 10 minutes, literally turned his back to her and began talking to the guy next to him. And that was the end of it. And she was saying, where did I go wrong? And my little practical advice was, you should have gone and Googled the guy's name and found out that he was something like a golfer or who knows what, and then start the conversation with some agreement before you get to the contradiction. Start talking to him about golf or anything, before you got to open those channels of communication before you launch into it. Otherwise, you're going to get the person's back. And in your case, people do that in the real world. They turn their back to you just to end the conversation.
And I must say, we lawyers are a tough audience in general, I think, because we think we know everything. We're not open to learn new things. This is the way I do it. I don't know why you're telling me to do it different. So it's not easy. It's not easy.
That's amazing. Let's see. I'm going to bring in Devo and Ayla to ask a few questions. And Devo, you'd better have a question, having worked in so much with counseling and folks like that what we're talking about here, what Doug's talking about, and Patrick must relate to your world of the practical things. And if not that, you also need to talk about this term that Doug said early on about the onslaught of information, because you've coined your own term for our purposes. So one of those two topics, take it away, Devo.
Well, I like the second one a little bit better. The first one obviously makes perfect sense. But actually, what's great is you guys are really educating me much deeper on the levels at which you guys research your communication. And I hadn't really thought about this. for some reason, I was kind of thinking, well, they just basically present the facts as best they can and let the facts speak for themselves. But if I've learned nothing else in working with the ABT, that no, they don't speak for themselves. When you put facts out, they're just these benign blocks that haven't been put together into anything yet.
How do we convince scientists of that? No, the data do not speak for themselves. To you, the data may be screaming out like, oh, here's the pattern, but they still.
But isn't that the essence of Shirley's law?
Yes.
Like, you throw all these facts out there, if you don't shape the narrative, they will, and you're not going to like it. That's always the case in our world with our clients.
Right. Well, everyone has pretty much their biases already built in. And the thing is that we don't know the biases necessarily. I mean, what you had said is a possible thing for that woman at the banquet. Learn a little bit about who this guy is. So discover what his biases are, so you can speak to him around those, and work with them. In other words, have a little bit of agreements in there somehow. But what your particular bailiwick on this storytelling is a little bit different than mine, because I usually get weeks of working with people, months, years, sometimes working with people as a mental counselor or mental coach. And basically, the first 6 months, sometimes, depending on how deeply entrenched the person is me just getting to know them, is just creating that agreement. So I'm living in that land before we start broaching the particular difficulties. The power of what you guys do and the time period with which you do it is really, really impressive to me.
And Ayla, have you got a question or some relevance of agreement in your world?
Yeah, no, for both of you guys, totally fascinated about what you do. And I've been a long time just, crime TV, just enjoy that genre. So very cool. One thing that I've been thinking about just listening to both of you, and Devo, you can probably back me up, because we usually work with the working circle groups. You have, someone usually starts with like all of this material and it's all important. But as we know, when everything is special, nothing is special. So for you guys, I'm just curious, because at some point something needs to get the axe, so to speak. So what is that, because these are high stakes, high rewards. I'm just curious about what that process might look like for you.
And exactly, starting with that catchphrase that we picked up from the people in the improv acting world, which is if everything is special, then nothing is special. You must deal with that a lot in your clients. Yes,
I think the case that Doug and I just worked on this weekend before last would be a good example of how we did that. Do you want to talk about it, Doug, or would you like me to give my take on it?
You go, please.
All right. So we had a client.
Keeping it very vague.
Of course. We had a client who
obviously
who had pled guilty, but was not able to really articulate any type of remorse or really any type of culpability for all practical purposes. They pled guilty and they regretted doing it, and it's a whole long story. But the reason that Doug really wanted me to be involved in this particular case is because the client had so much resistance to telling the truth. But I don't mean telling the truth about what he did. I mean telling the truth about himself. And in order for Doug, and for me as well, but speaking of Doug's process in sentence mitigation, in order for us to be able to do that, you need to know, the client needs to reveal themselves. They need to be vulnerable, and they need to be willing to actually reveal themselves and their past experiences, and most importantly, their past traumas. And this person had a huge amount of trauma in their life, like a shockingly large volume of different types of trauma. And that's really what we had to explore. But the purpose of us exploring that trauma was so that he could really set it aside to access it, but also set it aside when going into court and making what's called allocution, which is when the accused who's been found or pled guilty speaks to the judge before sentencing. It's called the right of allocution. And what we were struggling with is what part of this person's story is really what motivated him to commit the crime that he pled guilty to committing. And we worked through, for 2 days, we worked through all of these different stories of his trauma. And at one point, we had set down scarves to represent each of these different stories, and we put them in the form of a circle. And the idea here was to have the person walk through the circle and talk about each of these different places of trauma, talk about where they held it in their body and all of these sorts of things. And Doug, looking at it from the side, thought to himself, this is like a carousel. This is a carousel of trauma. And then it dawned on him, this is a carousel of chaos. This person's whole life has been dictated by nothing but chaos. And that became effectively the Dobzhansky. Did I get that right, Doug?
Yeah.
Or the Bob Jansky, if you want.
Nothing. And it went all the way back to childhood, every element. And so, Ayla, to kind of put meat on the bones of your question, which is, I don't find my process of axing things or cutting things so much as I do to find a way to incorporate them into, I guess, what Randy you'd call a nested ABT. So you have the overarching thing, but then these, what the wrong way to do it, I call it, is
finding the singular narrative.
Yes, we do as lawyers a lot of time what I call spaghetti lawyering, which is just throw everything on the wall and see what sticks, and that's and.
Right.
But I look at it as, can we like shoot a bullet through a hole of concrete? So it's this one singular thing that can penetrate, and so you can do that. You don't have to cut at that point, because everything falls under. You can fit everything under a big overarching ABT, or your one thing. In this case, it was chaos.
But doesn't that lead to some problems like what Randy was referring to, like the word that I love so much when we talk about let the facts speak for themselves, let all of the facts speak. We call it the deluge of information. And it just like the real term deluge in geology, it just flows down and completely covers everything, and it's this sedentary pile on top. So don't you run into that as well, where you have to be able to at least find the things that are more pertinent?
Actually, let me ask you specifically, in the courtroom, does that sometimes happen where a less competent lawyer ends up trying to cover up their lack of a narrative by just spewing out tons and tons of information?
That's the norm, I would say, Patrick. Wouldn't you agree? That's the default.
Absolutely.
Because we're never taught anything better. We're just taught to wallow in the facts and then do issue, rule, application, conclusion, and think the jury's going to understand any of it.
Right. I love that. What was that term? Carousel of chaos? That's powerful.
And by the way, like a lot of times I'm walking into court, my audience is primarily a judge, not a jury nowadays, because it's just for sentencing. But a lot of times I'm throwing my I'm doing the template. I will walk in and say, Your Honor, nothing in this case makes sense except in the light of mental health. Nothing in this case makes sense in the light of poison. And that is the way, that the deluge gets managed, because even if you have this a river of other facts and narrative story and everything else, it's all filtered through that, all comes back to that one thing.
Something else, interestingly, and this is a little bit of tribute to Dr. Dobzhansky himself way back when for phrasing it that way, because you could say, this whole case is about one word, and the one word is this. And yet there's something about that phraseology of nothing in this whole thing makes sense except in the light of, there's a little dramatic element there to it that I find a lot of the people really take to that. And it's a great way to just present it somehow, some way. I don't quite know how to dissect it, but it is a hook. It's better than just saying one word, because early on we had our model of the one paragraph, the one sentence, one word. But the Dobzhansky gives you that structure that really pulls people in.
Can I give you one more example of this? Because I think, Devo, this is, so capital cases, they're the ones with the most information. It's a lifetime of story, a lifetime of trauma and everything else. Working on this case, and I figured out nothing. It was a terrible murder case, and the client's brain wasn't functioning right. And that's really the essence of the mitigation. It's not a defense, but it's why he doesn't deserve to be executed. And I figured out nothing in this case makes sense except in the light of poison. Now are you interested? Are you interested? In the womb, his mother was smoking crack and using heroin. He was poisoned before he even made it to the planet. Then he moves to a small mining town where the air was poisoned, the water was poisoned, the soil was poisoned, everyone got cancer, and the lead poisoning, which affects the way your brain functions and your impulsivity and, your decision making, your executive functioning, all that stuff. And then he has this terrible familial relationship that's toxic. It's poison in his family, it's poison in his social environment. And guess what the state wants to do now? They want to inject him with poison to end his life.
Wow.
This is a child. This is a kid who has been poisoned since before he even entered the planet. And now you, government, want to do that. And that's the story.
So
Part
of what I think we run into when speaking with other lawyers, and for you, Randy, scientists, is as subject matter experts, we're very comfortable with the facts, and we can recite them and we feel confident about it, and we're not worried about our ability to go into court and cite the facts. It's way more difficult to come to a one word or one phrase that encapsulates everything and then use that as your theory of the case. It takes a lot more work, and it's a lot more risky because you're stepping out into unknown territory. And I think it's a lack of self-confidence that,
well, and that's our catchphrase. And that's our catchphrase in the end, is narrative is leadership. And, you know, at the core of narrative, you got to make these tough decisions. You got to find that singular narrative. And, well, I don't want to do that. All right, well, then you don't want to lead. And that's kind of how it works. And speaking of leading, it's time to lead this all to a conclusion. Ayla, you got one more thought or question on this? Or Devo, or maybe Patrick, you want to give us a final thought on where we're headed with propagating the ABT? I think that the three of us need to brainstorm on doing some workshops on this. Two of the great tools that we've got are the expertise of the two structuralists here, Devo and Ayla. They work with the working circles, which are half-hour structured sessions where one person presents their ABT, and then 4 or 5 people that are versed in that have just taken the course, know the basic tools, begin to just poke and prod through a structured 5-question set of questions for half an hour. And what you get at the other end is a much stronger core dynamic. You get yourself down to that singular narrative and all the other sorts of things. And the other tool is the ABT build that I do within the sessions, where I work with a single individual, usually 5 to 7 minutes, to kind of start the process. And it's kind of like we go from the build then into the full half-hour working circle. But those are the kinds of things that I got a feeling could be really valuable. Let's see. Matt has got a question about Star Wars or shooting stars, or what's it going to be about?
It is not about Star Wars. Thank you very much for once. I'm actually curious. So I know, like, you probably don't have as much time to spend with these clients as like an actual therapist, like over like months and months or years. But like over the short time where you're able to like do this reenactment therapy, do the psychodrama, do you notice any kind of like transformation in the clients, like and like anything happen to them on like a therapeutic level?
Absolutely. In fact, this last weekend, when we were working together, the wife had some interaction with him after we had worked with him, and was just astonished at how much different he appeared to her, and how much different he was than when he was working with the trauma therapist. And the thing about psychodrama, It really is, it's like taking 10 years of therapy and putting it into just a single drama. It's so profoundly therapeutic. And that's one of the things that attracted to me about it to begin with. And Doug and I are in the process. This is kind of to answer your question, Randy. Doug and I are in the process of co-authoring an article on the union of psychodrama and sentence mitigation. And we'll be explaining how psychodrama is used really in the discovering the story portion of the sentence mitigation process. And we'll be teaching lawyers on that as well, combining the two. So that's sort of where we're at.
Oh, well, so in other words, that's sort of a model, a 2-step model. You start off with the psychodrama that helps get you the narrative that you then shape into a presentational story. That's very, very cool. That makes sense to me. Wow. Huh.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So basically you're taking the tragedies and traumas of this person's life and Joseph Campbell's hero's journey model, putting them together to craft the story of like what happened to them. That's incredible. That's so cool.
Yeah.
But it's just the thing to stress here, because I know Doug runs into this, is we're doing it so that we're telling the whole truth. We're not doing it to be manipulative. because you
Right.
really are and by the way, you can't fake psychodrama. You can't do psychodrama and fake it. It's just not possible. So we're getting to the heart of the client's story in a way that I don't know any other way to do it that's as profoundly effective.
Wow. That was excellent. Actually, that's a good grand synthesis moment to wrap this all up with. You telling us there this idea of the two-step process, that you use the psychodrama to explore and get the core material, and then you use basic narrative structure to then put it into the structured form that everybody can connect with. That is so, oh my God, that is so deep. Because an awful lot of what I view all this stuff through is the lens of evolutionary biology. And at the core of evolutionary biology is natural selection, which I got to study with one of the greatest all-time communicators of evolution, Stephen Jay Gould. And he always said, at the core, it's a very simple two-step process. It's what natural selection is about is reproduction. You get lots and lots of variation, and then selection comes along and selects the ones that are going to survive. And it's that ratcheting over and over again, the two-step process. You want the wide variation, which is what you're talking about. The psychodrama lets you explore everything, with the wide, no blinders on. And then to make it presentable, you got to get in with the structure and be more critical and start throwing things out and structuring it and condensing it down. And it sounds like that's kind of at the simplest of all levels, what you're talking about with the overall model and the partnership between the two of you. So that is awesome. We are pretty much out of time here, but that's a great way to pull it all together at the end of this episode. Thanks very much, you guys. Any final word, Doug, on where you're headed with all this?
Well, I would say thank you for all that you do, and you've significantly changed the way improved the way I practice law, and I think made like the whole life thing. But I will say this, because we haven't talked about it, but the ABT is not just about my law. Every time I put a post on social media or something like that, I'm trying for the ABT. So just let me give you, because this is the way to get my shameless plug for my own podcast. But today we released an episode about David DePape, the guy that hit Paul Pelosi with a hammer.
Oh yeah.
So what do you think? This was my post. David DePape did a bad thing for all the wrong reasons, but even he has a mitigation story. Unfortunately, he will likely never allow his lawyers to tell it. Therefore, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison.
Wow.
Is that good?
God,
anyway,
we could spend another hour on that. You just opened up a can of worms right here at the end. Because I got 100 questions to ask you about that. But
the cool thing is I got a text from one of my best buddies here, Mark. His name is Mark Lerner, and he goes, "Nice ABT on Facebook today, dude." I'm like, "You've been paying attention, mister."
That was great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to have to do another one of these episodes in the not too distant future, because there's so much.
I would love it.
We just scratched the surface here, but it's really great. Here's working with you guys some more. Let's get going on that.
Okay. Yeah. So speaking of shameless plugs, Barone Defense Firm. Because I do the podcast, I always like to plug at the end. So I'll do Patrick the service so he doesn't have to plug himself. Check him out on Barone Defense Firm or Michigan Psychodrama Center. He runs the Michigan Psychodrama Center with his wife, who's Dr. Elizabeth Corby. And she's incredible. She was there doing the work with us. And by the way, I was participating in that. I went through the ringer myself, but that's a whole other story. And then if anybody wants to check out my podcast, setforsentencing.com.
Excellent. And was there a
thank
website?
you.
Back with Patrick, was there a website that for Patrick? What was that?
MichiganPsychodramaCenter.com and then BaroneDefenseFirm.com.
There we go. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys very, very much. And
thank you.
Thanks everybody else. And talk to you next time here on the ABT Time podcast.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks.
Bye, Devo. Bye, Ayla. Bye, Matt.
Hi, guys. Nice meeting you.
Thanks, Randy.